For over 45 months, Russia has waged war on Ukraine, and today we'll look at the military situation. I'm Julian Röpke, and this is BILD Situation Room. We begin with the latest situation in the Pokrovsk region in eastern Ukraine. There, soldiers from Myrnohrad, that is the neighboring town, have shared several videos with us together with a desperate distress call coming from within the city. They say, the supply situation there is getting worse and worse. The Ukrainian general staff needs to act here immediately. They're not saying they want to give up, they don't want to retreat or surrender or anything like that. Instead, they either want to be properly withdrawn from the city or better supplied. We're taking a close look at the situation right now using these exclusive videos that we've been provided here. And these videos come directly from Myrnohrad, and we can see how a large part of the houses there were destroyed by Russian bombs again and again in this ruinscape of the former 41,000 inhabitant city, where these houses were completely or at least partly reduced to rubble by relentless Russian bombardment and have since collapsed. Horrific scenes. We see it again, the exact same destruction in the next house. Again, there's another 50 by 50 meters completely gone from this. What are these? Always 8 or 10-story residential buildings, and that's exactly the situation on the ground right now. Myrnohrad is still being held by more than 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers, and according to our information, around 1,000 civilians are still in the city, down from the original 41,000. So those are the ones who either chose to hold out until the very end or simply weren't able to make their way out of the city. Or in the worst case scenario, those who are actually waiting there for the arrival of the Russian army. Let's watch the footage to the end because we've got something really interesting right at the end. Here down below, we don't just see a football field belonging to the school, but we can also clearly observe how the city has essentially been transformed into a full-scale fortress. Namely this here, yes, the buildings, we can see them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stories, but especially visible in front, I hope you can make it out, this zigzag pattern here, those are actually trench systems built here by the Ukrainians. That means we can safely assume this is simply a fact, that Ukrainian soldiers are occupying these buildings, at least having taken up position there and actively defending them against the ongoing Russian aggression as part of their frontline resistance, who are currently approaching the city from the side, or more precisely from multiple directions. We'll take a closer look at that in just a moment. Here again, we can see these trench systems built all around the houses. Taking a closer look, we can clearly see trenches running right across the street, so rather than using tunnels, you're at least able to move from house to house via these fortified positions. That's precisely why the Russians have not been able to capture Myrnohrad so far. We still know that over 70, some say 80% is under Ukrainian control, that the Russians haven't managed, despite their edge, encirclement and heavy bombardment, the bombardment we keep seeing, to actively get into Myrnohrad so far. But that's precisely the argument made by the soldiers there. They say these are the best fighters we've got. They're simply the best troops we've got stationed over there. You'd actually have to pull out personnel from a total of 5 different Ukrainian brigades just to allow them to continue fighting effectively elsewhere, but not anymore in Myrnohrad. Let's quickly take a moment to look at another video sent to us by the soldiers stationed there, which is meant to show that the corridor, the supply corridor, essentially no longer exists because Russian soldiers are moving everywhere. We'll take a quick look at the videos first, as I said, and then the map. Here we can clearly see Russian troops on the move, advancing steadily northwest of Myrnohrad, making their way into abandoned houses in the small villages scattered throughout the area. One of them is Rivne, we'll see that in a moment. We also see these farming facilities here, probably for chickens, that were set up there at some point. We can also see Russian soldiers quite clearly here as they're moving along the perimeter of these facilities. Here on the left we see the thermal imaging, here the standard view, and yet again it's the same situation. Soldiers can clearly spot the Russians and keep them in sight using their cameras, but they're unable to engage them anymore. That's what they told us. The situation is extremely tense. We can see Russian soldiers here who are moving slowly. There's now an absolute shortage, not only of ammunition for the drones and munitions in general, but also when it comes to food supplies. They're making that very clear to us. It's extremely difficult. They're still being supplied, but only by airdrops and airlifts. That means from so-called bomb drones, which instead are equipped with essential supplies like food and water, as well as from those so-called robotic complexes operating in the area. That means these 2-axle robots that move forward slowly because it's so dangerous there. And because there simply aren't any routes for soldiers to go by foot anymore. We're taking a look at the situation around Pokrovsk. We reported that most of Pokrovsk has now fallen, actually all the relevant areas, including the city center. There might still be some Ukrainian soldiers in basement systems up north in the city, but that's simply no longer relevant for defending the town. What we do see, however, is that Myrnohrad is extremely relevant. We can tell that from the road networks, as just mentioned, with roughly 70% still under Ukrainian control, and the footage clearly shows it. The ones we've just seen, these Russian soldiers, they're located, for example, right here in Rivne. They're positioned, for instance, along the road toward Rodinska to the north. They're currently stationed at these various former poultry farming facilities, and they remain positioned just north of the city. That means if we take a closer look at the current locations shown in the videos, we can clearly see it's almost impossible for Ukrainians from Myrnohrad to get out of or back into the area they're still holding at the moment. And the soldiers tell us that some of the drone pilots wanted to rotate out a few days ago. They had originally planned to pull out of Myrnohrad in order to be replaced by fresh units. However, they ran into Russian infantry, specifically Russian assault troops, northwest of Myrnohrad, and were forced to fall back into the city again. Because the Russians are simply better equipped and more battle-hardened and specifically trained for close combat and infantry warfare. While the Ukrainian specialists who wanted to withdraw here were specialized in drones. That means they had completely different and inferior weapons at their disposal, so they weren't able to defend themselves here anymore and ultimately had no other option but to pull back once again, just as they did before. We see the situation once more. Pokrovsk, according to Deep State map, is shown mostly in dark red, indicating firm Russian control, yet at the same time continues to remain overwhelmingly contested by ongoing fighting. And contested ultimately means there are Russian soldiers there. There might still be some Ukrainian soldiers present as well. However, the whole area is no longer territory held by Ukraine, but rather an area where, as an infantryman or someone looking to rotate in, you'd actually come face to face with Russian troops, and then it's extremely dangerous. We're looking at more footage from the Myrnohrad area and slightly further north, because parallel to this encirclement to the infantry advancing northward and the glide bombs, there are also Russian armored units that are still trying to push forward toward Myrnohrad, and we have new videos showing us exactly that. Fortunately, these units were intercepted, but as previously noted, we are now also clearly seeing mechanized advances by the Russian army toward Myrnohrad and the areas north of it. First, we see the attack on a Russian BMP-2, and now once again, interestingly, an MTU-72. That's the bridge-laying vehicle we already saw recently. An MTU-20 based on a T-55, and here we have an MTU-72 built on a T-72, roughly 20 years newer. These systems were deployed here as well. In Shakov, there are several small rivers and lakes that were likely intended to be crossed using them. That didn't work here either. We can see it. Every heavy system the Russians bring to the front is subsequently destroyed by the Ukrainian army. Here's another angle, including the entry. This MTU-72 was hit here too. Attacked and ultimately destroyed by the Ukrainian Army's 1st Corps together with the Azov regiment in this location. We're now seeing additional footage, I think in this case from a different unit. Again, we see a T-80 that was deployed in the field, heavily upgraded with various types of add-on armor, particularly on the sides, and also fitted with mine rollers for enhanced protection. Here we can see the two S-24 Relight explosive reactive armor that was fitted besides the structure on top of the tank. And even in this particular case, the Russians were unable to succeed, despite the extensive overbuilding and the heavy protective measures that were put in place. The footage is from 7th Corps here. We see it again. Russians failed to protect the vehicles. Again, all the tanks and infantry fighting vehicles that were deployed were destroyed by the Ukrainians. Nonetheless, the situation over in Myrnohrad remains extremely tense for the troops stationed there. And that's why they're now urgently appealing to or formally calling on the Ukrainian General Staff to either fight back and reopen the corridor we just saw. They said we could send a full brigade over there if necessary. You might need several hundred, maybe even over 1,000 soldiers to keep that area secure in order to continue supplying Myrnohrad. Or, in the other scenario, if that's simply not feasible, to conduct an orderly withdrawal from there so they don't end up retreating in the hundreds or thousands, falling into the Russians' hands in the end. From Donetsk and Pokrovsk in the east, we head to Zaporizhzhia in southeastern Ukraine. New footage shows Russian forces continuing their advance on Huljajpole. We have at least one village that has fallen under their control. Let's take a look at the footage here. Once again, it's heavy bombs being used, and not just that, other weapons as well. Soon we'll see, starting the typical Russian propaganda footage. They call this village Chervonoy, but its actual name is Vysoky in Ukrainian. Still, we're talking about a small village located just east of Huljajpole. Now we're seeing the glide bombs hitting again, those very concentrated explosions. 4 of them very close to each other. Only the one in the upper right missed the target by a few meters. And now, which is particularly alarming to see, we have a TOS-1A here firing thermobaric rockets, easily identifiable by the explosions, spreading across the entire area of Vysok. And the frightening part is that the TOS-1A has an effective range of only about 10 kilometers, at most 15, and then it's highly unguided. And what we're seeing now is that the Russians are increasingly able to move these systems right up to the front lines, positioning them just around 10 kilometers away, even though that's well within the operational range of Ukrainian drones. Practically speaking, though, the Ukrainians currently don't seem able to hold their ground here in Zaporizhzhia and locate these systems. First with their surveillance drones, and then also to attack with kamikaze drones or with artillery. In other words, a really difficult situation for Ukraine around Huljajpole. We're now seeing, as always, these fiber optic guided attacks, among others, on two S-1 self-propelled howitzers of the Ukrainian armed forces, but also on other vehicles and mobile units. And now we're seeing footage showing that once again, after this heavy shelling, after taking out Ukrainian defenses, the Russians are moving into Vysoke and advancing through the destroyed town, hoisting their flag. It's truly a difficult situation. We'll see it on the map for Huljajpole in a moment, because the Russians are approaching the city not only from the south and east, but also slowly from the north, meaning an attack on the city. A full encirclement of the city is becoming increasingly likely. Here again, the footage from Vysoke, which clearly shows that this village is under Russian control after it was completely destroyed. As we can see here, of course, no one lives here anymore. But the Russians couldn't care less about that during their advance, because it's not about liberating anyone. It's only about expanding Putin's empire and pushing Russian territory further. We're looking at more footage now from the north of Huljajpole. There too, we're focusing just on the flag videos posted by Russian soldiers. They've advanced quite far. This we can see right away on the map, about 10 kilometers further west than previously located. And we can see here in this small locality, also named Dobropilya, which is coincidentally the same name as the city in Donetsk. Russians are flying their flag here too, but the weather's terrible. That means it's really come a long way, 10 kilometers further west than the farthest point we knew of up until this moment. Solotke was that small village right there, so we can clearly see how the Russians took advantage of the poor weather conditions to get through Ukraine's drone defenses and raise their flag here. And it's also not entirely clear whether they actually have full control over the small village, as the flag-raising videos were exclusively recorded in just a limited section of the town. There's also this small agricultural plain. It might have been suitable for propaganda footage too, but so far we haven't seen any Russian flags on it. We'll take a closer look at this on the map to better understand why the situation for Huljajpole is so difficult, and then check out the two settlements, especially the one we just showed. On one side, Vysoke here. In the east, according to the deep state map data provided by our mapping service, the Russians have already advanced and pushed forward 5 kilometers in a westerly direction from their original positions. That means even so, the video was only published yesterday. Apparently the Russians waited a bit. And the second thing, which is particularly alarming, was this footage coming from Dobropilya up here. And we can see it's today's map from Deep State Map. The Ukrainian activists haven't even put the Russians on the map here yet. They think the Russians are still around 3 kilometers away from this particular village. And as mentioned, the last confirmed location that's under Russian control remains Solotka. So what we're seeing here is a situation where Russian forces have managed to push forward roughly 10 kilometers to the west over the course of about 1 week. Again, we don't know whether they've established a foothold there or just raised the flag and then pulled out again. Definitely an extremely difficult situation for the Ukrainians, because once again it's the same scenario the Russians have been using all along. You launch a frontal assault from the east, attempt to flank in the south where positions have held for several years, but now they're also trying to outflank from the north. So that in the end the defenders are left with no choice but to either make their stand in a half pocket or ultimately fall back. Finally, we'll look at Huljajpole. Russian footage shows which Ukrainian positions still hold, confirming major defenses around the city, protecting the town entrances. And the footage we're about to see comes from this general area, specifically from the northeastern flank of Huljajpole, giving us a clear view of the situation there. Right from that former 15,000 inhabitant town itself. As mentioned, we should roughly remember the green marked area, and now we're seeing the footage of Ukrainian positions at the town entrance. We can show these images now without any issues, because we can see the Russians are checking everything out. They're looking at it from the air, seeing how it all looks. So we're not giving away any secrets here, but you can clearly see these are the Ukrainian positions along the roads, stretching across the fields, and also just along the outermost houses of Huljajpole, where the Russians haven't managed to reach yet. We can see it was built up over months, not just these zigzags out in the fields, but also blast walls were constructed, for instance, to protect against Russian shelling. The trenches here were reinforced with wooden beams, and that there are also positions here for armored vehicles and so on. Large-scale installations set up here by the Ukrainian army. The outer edge of Huljajpole, effectively the last defensive line that the Russians ultimately failed to breach, successfully protecting the town from the full force of the Russian attack. Like I said, the Russians are closely monitoring the situation, actively working to map it out right now and preparing accordingly to strike these areas once more from the air. First things first, before attempting to advance with infantry units and move into the city to carry out a full-on assault. We don't know yet how this battle will turn out, but we've just seen that even if these installations hold, as we saw earlier in Myrnohrad, if these installations withstand, if they're not stormed, the Russians are already moving ahead to flank and bypass the city at the very same time. That means in the worst case scenario, we could end up in Huljajpole with defenders eventually saying, yes, we're still here, but we've simply run out of ammunition and have less and less food. So please get us out of here. From the Ukrainian front, we move to the airspace over Ukraine, where we have new footage showing us how active the Ukrainian drone defense is. First, footage showing us how Russian reconnaissance drones are being shot down, mostly the Zala 421 type, but others as well. And we're really seeing some truly impressive footage here, supercam views, including an Orlan 10, lots of Russian drones actively operating over Ukraine. We're actually also seeing hits from the Ukrainian side. Every now and then a Molnia or a Lancet, meaning some kamikaze drones, but mostly reconnaissance drones, that are operating over Ukraine, but are being systematically targeted, as we can see here, intercepted and destroyed. Of course, it's a summary. Naturally, some drones do get through, but overall, we're really seeing significant successes by Ukraine, with dozens being intercepted, hundreds, thousands of Russian reconnaissance drones worth many millions of euros being shot down. And it's not just reconnaissance drones being shot down. There's actually an interesting video showing that Russia has apparently deployed a new type of drone at one point along the front called Italmas. There are already a few entries on it, even though it's relatively new. The Italmas looks somewhat like a smaller scale copy of the Shahed. The delta shape is clearly noticeable here, but the white paint scheme is what really stands out. The warhead, supposedly weighing in at 45 kilos, that's quite a significant amount, and the range is around 200 kilometers for these drones. That's about a quarter of the Shaheds. Nonetheless, we can clearly see here with the engine up front, an interesting new Russian drone. Now let's set this whole thing in motion, as this particular unit of the Ukrainian army has been specifically trained and equipped to intercept these types of drones. And they seem to have really solid intel on exactly where these Italmas will show up and what flight paths they'll take. And then also has the necessary means to deploy interceptor drones there to take those Italmas out of the sky. So really interesting footage that shows us if Ukraine is well prepared, if you have the right radar systems, if you have the right intercept drones, you can defend yourself well against Russian drones. These are all Italmas drones being targeted here. And it's also a similar region everywhere we're seeing down there. So yes, a very successful Ukrainian attempt at defense. Of course, we don't know exactly how many of the drones got through. We've seen roughly 10 or so that were intercepted here. Whether the Russians attacked with 10, 20, or even 100, that's just not clear. So we can see the Ukrainians are doing their best and are able to intercept many Russian drones. However, despite their efforts, a large portion still gets through because of the sheer volume of Russian attack capabilities. In conclusion, let's take a moment to look at an extremely impressive video from Ukraine's Azov units, which clearly illustrates how AI is now being used, or at least how it's increasingly being heavily utilized in these Ukrainian attack drones. To identify and attack the enemy, these are truly footage clips we've never seen anything quite like before. We can see these drones likely still have human support, yet are already advanced enough to identify targets autonomously, marking a major leap in warfare tech and reshaping how modern combat operations are conducted. I think you really just need to pause it at the right moment. So here, for example, we can see targets behind that the drone has identified but isn't flying toward, shown in green. Up here in front, we have this target, which is still showing up as purple. Right now, there's a light vehicle, so vehicle light, that's currently being attacked here. Now we can see how it was then logged in, basically how it changed from purple to red and started being attacked. Also extremely clear in the next scene. Here we have targets that the drone detects, ones that the drone's AI has identified, but which are currently secondary. But the one in the back is the logged target, which we also see again here enlarged. So that's the target the drone is currently approaching, though it gives the operator the information. I've got some additional targets down here marked in green. They're not primary for you right now, but we can save them for later and take them out too. Here again you see several vehicles lined up one behind the other. Clearly visible here, down below for instance, this 3 shows that target 3 has been identified, is now green and burning, but isn't currently being approached. Now, however, things are changing. It's now being logged in, and once again, as mentioned, we can see the approach to this specific target. Once again, we see the fire here. We want to stop it at the right moment. Here it's unknown. The drone indicates it has detected a vehicle, but doesn't know what type of vehicle it is. Shortly after, the drone sees, it's a vehicle, so armored vehicle, VEHARM, meaning it's an armored vehicle. The drone knows exactly what it's diving at. At least that's what it's clearly communicating to the operator in real time. It's an armored vehicle. Do you want to engage? And at that moment, the operator uses his mouse to confirm, yes, that's the target I want. Go ahead and engage. We see it gets logged in, switches to red. So the pilot receives the info. This is my first target. We've also seen additional targets behind in green, which can be attacked later on. So we're really looking at an extremely advanced case of AI being deployed out there on the actual battlefield here. Again, we see here that the pilot, still relatively far away, can decide which target he finds more interesting, which one he'd like to attack first. Now we see here that the whole thing is controlled with the mouse, and accordingly, the information we see here, the target the pilot has indicated he wants, is also engaged. We also see a bit of the downsides with that, because I see something here, something the drone saw in the forest. However, it's disappearing now. Here it is. Not of interest anymore, so the pilot's switching to the target up there. Maybe it was interesting to him from the start, and it says, okay, the vehicle is recognized, so the silhouette is being detected here by the AI, so I'm targeting this silhouette, not the individual component. Maybe it can already detect a lone Russian soldier out in the woods. We have not yet seen anything like this with how AI is being used. Still in its early stages, of course, but just the entire concept that the drone actively assists me by identifying the exact type of vehicle and then leaves the final decision up to the pilot which vehicle he'd prefer to engage based on the vehicle's current condition, or at least its specific type. That's something entirely new, which we'll likely be seeing on the Russian side fairly soon as well, which will likely spread across battlefields, especially in Ukraine, but also on future ones, and is expected to dominate them for years to come, fundamentally shaping the nature of modern warfare.